Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guests today on Writers at Work are the brothers Lee and Andrew Child, best-selling authors together and on their own. Lee is best known for writing a crime series featuring the singular character Jack Reacher. Responsibility for that series is now shared between Lee and Andrew, who, beginning with 2020's The Sentinel, is his co-author. The next joint Reacher novel, In Too Deep, arrives in mid-October. After graduating from law school in Sheffield, England, Lee worked as a presentation director for Granada TV and was involved, to a degree, in such programs as Cracker and Prime Suspect. In his late 30s, corporate restructuring forced him out, and shortly thereafter, he began to write what became Killing Floor, the first Reacher novel. Andrew is also a graduate of the University of Sheffield. He studied drama and English literature. He founded a theater company, then took a corporate job before leaving to write his first novel, Even, published in 2009 under his birth name, Andrew Grant. Thus, he found an appreciative readership on his own. I've known Lee forever. We worked on a few things together over the years, but I met Andrew for the first time a few weeks ago. It's my pleasure to speak to both of them, this time with an emphasis on what's happening with the Reacher series. Lee and Andrew Child, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Okay,
Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for having us.
great. So there's a 14-year age difference between you two. For some siblings, that's a gap that's difficult to bridge. Lee, do you recall when you realized that that little toddler had become an emerging adult with developing interests?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the key. Everybody's saying to us, how can you work together? You're brothers. And certainly my other two brothers I could not work with because we lived together as little kids. And we had all those tedious, nonsensical kid disputes year after year after year. I broke their toys. They broke my toys. They ratted me out. I ratted them out. It was a nightmare. But the gap between me and Andrew means that we effectively never lived under the same roof as siblings. It came along later. And looking back, yeah, I loved it when he was about 3 or 4 and he was developing that little spark of individual personality, watching who he would become. And I pretty soon knew that he could be a writer because he invented an imaginary friend and at the age of about 5, and it was the most detailed and the most well-developed character that you could imagine. I thought, looking back on it, because I was not a writer then, obviously, but looking back on it, I think, that was the first sign.
Andrew, do you remember that? Do you remember that character you developed?
I do. And I think, I didn't really associate it with anything to do with ever being a writer or having any aptitude as a writer. For me, it was more just an escape mechanism, because with Lee out of the house, I didn't realize until later, but, we both had this identical feeling that we were changelings or something. We were living in an environment that we didn't belong in, where everyone was different to us, where no one understood us, where everything that happened, we just wanted to escape from. So I think having this imaginary character is entirely down to just that way of creating an alternative world that I would rather have been living in.
So you were approaching your teen years when Lee was already at the Granada. Were you aware of what he was doing?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that I was still trapped in the situation looking out. And for me, the fact that he had escaped, he was living a great life, that gave me hope. It made me think, well, perhaps one day I'll be able to get it out of here and do what I want to do. So, and we were, like you said, we didn't live together when we were kids, but we became close in those years, and we would talk on the phone. I would go visit, so we spent as much time in contact as we could.
Lee, I have this image of you doing your corporate business, but absorbing so much about storytelling from Linda LaPlante and Jimmy McGovern and Ken Taylor and Derek Granger, some of the writers behind Granada's most popular series. Is that close to correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was not an executive. I've never worked 9 to 5, 5 days a week. I was an operational person in a particular role that was literally the central role to television broadcasting. Our room was called Central Control Room, and all the material came into it, and then we parceled it out in the correct sequence to the transmitter, and people saw it at home. So that meant that we saw everything. And because we were central, we also bumped into everybody because everybody would come in fussing about this is not ready yet. Are you sure you got the right version? And we would meet everybody. And ultimately, though, what it was in my nearly 20 years, I did 40,000 hours of that job. And that reprograms your brain. It sort of imprints in your DNA the rhythms, the grammar of storytelling to the point where when I was writing my own books, the end of a chapter to me was utterly instinctive. You just knew you were there at the end of the chapter, ready for the next. And that I think was a product of having experienced this wide range. Linda LaPlante writing Prime Suspect, that was great, but that was only a tiny part of it. Every other show came through our room. We had to pay the same attention to everything. So you would learn different methods, different flavors, and none of it is immediately transferable. That was the first big stumbling block. It's not the same thing at all, TV and books, but the background information, the gut feeling that you get, that is crucial.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this earlier. You were based in Manchester, and Cracker was set in Manchester. Did you have a sense of how important the setting was to the story, or was it not important? I mean, was it vivid to you? Did it feel true to you?
Not really. I mean, I developed a kind of allergy towards certain places in the world that try to portray themselves as really edgy and dangerous. And Manchester really was not edgy and dangerous. It was a sprawling post-industrial city with numerous problems, of course, but there were not organized gangs roaming the streets. I was there, as I say, 20 years, and I saw 2 or 3 incidences of street crime in 20 years, but that's all. And I find it a little bit desperate the way that certain places want to portray themselves as the epicenter of danger. There's Christchurch in New Zealand apparently you're almost certain to be killed there, according to some writers. It just seemed to me a little wrong. And in my own career, what I try to do with Reacher was always avoid the overblown idea about the opposition. I prefer to make it squalid or local or banal if possible, rather than try and blow everything up into this huge crisis.
Yeah. So Lee is out, Andrew, this observation, Lee is out at Granada and he decides to write Killing Floor. When did you become aware that he was going to become a novelist?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? Because I mean, how do you answer it? When do you actually become a novelist? I knew when he had started to write the book because I knew that he'd been fired, he was out of work, he had a family to feed, a mortgage to pay. And I remember when he said that he had this genius idea in order to cover all of these bills, and that was that he was going to write a book. I remember thinking, I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way forward. But I knew he was doing it, and I had faith in him that if he was going to do it, he was going to do it brilliantly. But then when the book was finished, and of course, now we're all familiar with the way that the industry works. I knew nothing about it being completely on the outside, and he was just at the beginning of the journey. So when he had the manuscript finished and was looking for an agent, he sent me a copy, and it was still handwritten in pencil. And it was the most nerve-wracking thing ever. You know, normally when you get a new book, you're excited to read it, aren't you? It's a lovely thing. Opening a book for the first time and reading the first sentence. But with this one, I was terrified because I thought, well, what if it's no good? Firstly, I'm going to be the one who has to tell him. And secondly, you know, what's going to happen then? Is he going to have to come and sleep in my spare room? Am I going to have to send him food parcels, you know? So I was absolutely terrified reading that book for the first time. And, you know, fortunately, of course, it turned out to be a magnificent book, and I had nothing to worry about, and it was just wonderful to read it. But you know, I remember that very well.
Yeah. Lee, did you odd question, did you know how good Killing Floor was? I mean, when you finished it, did you think, well, I've done it, or I hope I've done it, or I don't know if I've done it?
You never know. You know, that's one thing I'd learned from the TV years, that everything is unpredictable. Every success is uh, unexpected, really. It's a bit like, if you remember a photographer called Diane Arbus.
Sure, sure.
She said every photograph you take is either better or worse than you expect. And I think producing any creative thing is like that. You can't put an accurate target on it and say, yeah, I want it to hit that spot. It's inevitably going to either fall short or be better than you thought. And I remember writing Killing Floor as being an incredibly intense experience because it was new, it was fresh, it was something I'd never done before. I was desperate because I was out of work. The stakes were incredibly high. So I remember the intensity of it, and I remember really living it, being the characters. And at the end of it, I actually cried because I would not see those characters again, because I already knew Reacher would move on as a loner. And so the supporting cast would be left behind. And I remember it being very intense, but I never reread the book. I did all the necessary steps that you do with publishing. You know, you do the edit, and then you get the page proofs and you check the page proofs. But that is the last time I ever saw that book for 25 years. And then there's an organization called PEN that is a charity that basically these days defends journalism around the world, journalists getting arrested and so on. They're activists on their behalf. And they came up with an idea for fundraising, which was they would get authors to get a first edition of their first book and hand annotate it in the margins with pencil as to, you know, why you did this, what you were thinking, and so on. And they found those sell really well and raised them a lot of money. So I did that a couple of years ago, and that was 25 years since I'd finished Killing Floor. I had never reread it. So I had to reread it as I went through annotating it. And I went into it thinking, God, this is going to be embarrassing. This is going to be a first novel clunkiness to it or something. But actually, it was very good. And I was surprised how smooth and complete it was. And I was really, really happy for a day. I thought, this is fantastic. And then I thought, wait a minute, haven't I got any better in the subsequent 20 plus books?
You know, I reread Killing Floor recently, and it's like one of those great first albums. You know, it really holds up. And I don't think it has anything to say about what followed it. You know, I mean, the quality is in the first thing doesn't mean it's not in the next thing. I'm just glad to hear you say that you thought it held up too. Andrew, when you were observing Lee in this period, did you think, from a brother's point of view, well, he seems happy now, or I think he's found his purpose? Any thoughts like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always felt that he as far as I knew, enjoyed working in TV, you know, because it was a really exciting environment for a period of time, because the company he was working for was doing a great job, and they were making some amazing shows. They had some great writers, some great actors, and the stuff that coming out of it was great. And I felt like he was very satisfied and happy in that time. But then, you know, a lot of corporations take a wrong turn, and it seemed as if a lot of the decisions that were being made were stupid and destructive. And I was conscious of how unhappy he'd become, not simply because the environment he was in had suddenly become less enjoyable, but because something that had been really good was being destroyed. So I knew that he was miserable. And so when he started writing, and there's clearly going to be a spell where there's uncertainty. You don't know how it's going to work. You don't really know how the industry works. So there's a degree where you're kind of getting by on a wing and a prayer. But once it started to come together, once there were several books into the series, I certainly got that impression, because I would always go to as many of his events as possible, particularly the launch events and other, random events that occurred. And I'd be sitting in the audience. And so I would be getting a really good sense of the kind, the impact that the Reacher books were having on people. And I could see the degree of satisfaction that brought. So I felt really, really happy about that, because I know that he'd gone through that because no one enjoys losing your job. No one enjoys wondering if you're gonna, get your house foreclosed on. That's a horrible thing to have to go through. So it was wonderful to see him come through the other side and do it with flying colors.
And from a reader's point of view, what did you find appealing about Lee's writing? Could you
Well,
separate that brother from writer thing?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, Jim, because there's definitely that there definitely was a separation that needed to be done. Because you take Killing Floyd, like I said, when I first read it, the way the book's constructed, it's first person narrative, and Breach is arrested, taken to the police station. He's not particularly cooperative, so you're well into the book before you learn his name. And I remember very clearly thinking, I don't know the character's name, but I know this character. And I think a lot of that was because it stemmed from his imagination and his subconscious. And in those ways, we're very similar people. So there was a degree of familiarity there that I felt, that I think came from that relationship. But beyond that, I love crime fiction. I have done for donkey's years, decades. And so, when you pick up a book in a particular genre that you like, you're looking, I think, for something that it doesn't entirely inhabit everything that you expect from that genre. You want all of the high notes, but you want it to go beyond that. You want it to bring something extra and something that you hadn't anticipated. And that is exactly what Reacher did for me, because it ticked all the boxes that I wanted from a crime fiction novel, but brought so much more as well, in terms of just the enjoyment that you felt from sort of metaphorically hanging out with this character.
Yeah. Allow me an observation, okay? And if I'm wrong, either of you can just jump in and tell me so. I think there's a misconception, particularly among people who dip in and out of the series, or who only know it from film and TV, that it's Reacher comes to town, Reacher gets in trouble, Reacher beats up a few people, and Reacher leaves. But there's so much more to those books than that. And that's why I want to get back to setting for a minute. Lee, you never fail to give the reader a tactile sense of where Reacher is at that moment. And it's so subtly applied, and it's easy to miss if you're just looking for action. I mean, there's genuine gravitas in the text. Um, how did mastery is too strong a word, I think, but in the beginning, when you were writing, how did you find the ability to develop setting in that manner?
Ah, so it's a good question, in as much as setting is always my first instinctive decision for any book. And I don't want to say I'm pretentious about it, but you'll get this with your wearing your other hat about music, that if you're trying to compose a piece of music, you tend to first of all think of the key, that maybe E flat minor is what you're going to do this time, which is completely different sound than G major. It infuses everything with an essential kind of quality there in the beginning. And so setting is the equivalent of that, I think. Is it going to be a hot weather book or cold? Is it going to be smooth landscape or is it going to be rough gray landscape? And that is a sort of instinctive decision that it just creeps up on me. Is it going to be the coast of Maine in April, granite and gray and cold? Is it going to be the west of Texas in the summer where it's baking hot? That's the first decision that I take instinctively and unknowingly sometimes, and you just start working toward that. And then as far as the reflection goes, yeah, I think that we're in a genre that values pace, no question about it. And we are aiming for readers who are not necessarily expert or habitual readers. We're looking for casual readers that need to be propelled through the book. Like your car is at the car wash, it hooks on the chain and it gets pulled through. That you need to supply that too. But pace is meaningless if it's all fast all the time. If it's unvarying, that's really the same thing as having no pace at all. So I was always very conscious. A novel is a long piece of work. It takes many hours or even days for somebody to read it. There is time for the slow parts, the quiet parts, the reflective parts, fun parts. It doesn't have to be all action and fighting. And it's better if it isn't, because then those scenes stand out all the more.
And Andrew, when you were thinking about becoming a writer, did you recognize that Lee had this talent to put us in a place that was definitive? I'll give you an example. I was reading The Sentinel, and Lee, you had Reacher in an alley, and people were coming up to him to fight him. And I thought to myself, my God, I am in this alley with these people. Somehow he's put 3 walls around me, and I'm right there. Andrew, that's not, I mean, that's a skill, right?
Well, let me jump in here and say that was Andrew's skill. So The Sentinel was the first book that we collaborated on, and a lot of it is pure Andrew. And I think, yeah, I have that facility. He does too, because we're similar minds. But he's also read, as he said, he read the very first book in pencil. He's read every book since. He's been steeped in this for a quarter century. So it was a blend really of being familiar with the series, having the same personality and understanding the approach. So what I've loved about it, the 4 books we collaborated on, and then this new one, In Too Deep, watching Andrew deal with it. And I say the same thing back to him, that these are great Reacher books, but occasionally I can just get the flavor of Andrew's own language in some of the replies, which is actually one of my great satisfactions in life, is watching Andrew deal with somebody who is either stupid or a bully. I was at his house one time, and a text came in, some problem, somebody hasn't done something right, something is not showing up when it should be. And I just sit back in anticipation. Andrew dials the phone. 5 minutes later, the problem is sorted out in a very Reacher-like fashion. so that you cannot help put yourself in the book. And it is a lucky coincidence that he and I are so similar in so many ways.
Can you pick up on that, Andrew? I guess I made the same mistake that other readers would make, thinking that that Sentinel was Lee's book and that you kind of put a little bit in there. And now I find out that one of my favorite scenes was written by you.
Well, gee, I'm biased, obviously, but I wouldn't call that a mistake. I would call that the biggest compliment anybody could possibly pay. So thank you. But yeah, in terms of the question, yeah, absolutely. From Killing Floor onward, I was absolutely aware of the way that setting in his books informed the plot and contributed to the sort of visceral experience that you had, because you could see yourself in the setting. It wasn't something that you were just sort of imagining as if it was cartoon characters or stick figures. You could see and feel and smell what it was like, which is part of the enjoyment. And they're so varied too. Make Me is one of my favorites in terms of the descriptions of the location and the way that the location determines what can and can't happen with the action. Absolutely love that. From my own approach, in terms of the way I begin, again, I generally have a picture in my mind of some sort of scene. So Better Off Dead was the second one that we did, and I had an idea. Don't know where it came from. I just had an idea of this sort of vast kind of desert-like expanse of arid, inhospitable land with one single tree growing there, and a car crashed into that tree. And the question then was, okay, well, who who drove the car? Where did it crash? You know, everything. And so it all stemmed from that image. And the same with In Too Deep. You know, that came about. You know, it happens off the page, but you know, the book. The key action at the beginning of the book is that Reacher has been involved in a car accident, and you know he's hitching a ride, and the driver screws up and crashes the car. And in my mind, the thing that started it all was, you know, we went to the Ozarks years and years ago for a concert actually, and I remember driving around and being impressed with how beautiful it was, and some of it being very remote. And I had this picture of a switchback. You know, hairpin bend with a car, you know, on its roof, having crashed, driving around this bend too fast. And again, that's where it all stems from. So I agree that the setting, not only does it need to be absolutely integral to the book, but it's generally where it's the germ of an idea that gives rise to the whole book. But it's something I find one of the most difficult things to get right. So absolutely delighted that you like that scene, by the way.
No, I did very much. Lee, when did the idea come to you that maybe it was time for you to step away from Reacher? And did you know how you were going to do it?
I had a couple of different exit strategies, and I needed to put them into action when I sensed some particular thing that dates back to my previous life as a reader. Because it's a truism to say that all writers have been massive readers first. You know, that's inevitable. Of course we are. And what I try and do is remember how I felt as a reader and use that to supply the future stuff for more readers. But one of the things I remember as a reader, especially as a younger person, was that feeling, first of all, of loving a new to you author or series, just loving it. You know, you read the first one, it's fantastic. You then run back to the library and get the second one. It's fantastic. But too often around, say, you know, book 6, book 8, or whatever, the quality drops away. And you get the sense that the author is grown old and tired and lazy and has run out of energy, run out of gas, and is just phoning it in now. And maybe I was unlucky, but that happened over and over again with series that I loved. And so I made myself a promise when I started that if I ever sensed that I was running out of gas and that next year I would be phoning it in, I would stop out of fairness to my readers and out of loyalty to that old promise that I'd made myself. And how to get out of it was the first plan was that Reacher would die. He would, you know, he's a smart guy. It would be intricate to plot, but I had the basic idea that he would get into something, he would be protecting somebody, and he would be forced into a situation where he either gave himself up or the protectee, and Reacher being Reacher would give himself up. And so the last scene of the book, he would bleed to death on a filthy motel bathroom floor. And I even had the title Die Lonely. And that was the plan. But over the years, I felt, because of the response coming in from readers, that would be gratuitously cruel. They would hate it. So then I developed a metaphorical version of that. In other words, the standard Reacher setup, he solves the problem. He then walks back to the bus depot, ready to go to the next place. But on the way, he stops and he thinks, yeah, this is a pretty nice place. Maybe I will adopt a dog and rent a room. And that would be the metaphorical equivalent.
Yeah.
And then I got the idea of asking Andrew to carry on with it. Because the last one I did all by myself, completely solo, was book number 24, called Blue Moon. And I don't think anybody would know. I don't think they would notice. But there were a couple of days during the writing of that book where I just did not want to do it. And maybe I was a little hypervigilant, but I just took that as a bad sign. And I said, yeah, old Father Time has caught up with you. You're running out of energy. You have got to quit while you're ahead.
Lee, you brought up something that has been on my mind for a while about when to give up. And you really said it beautifully, because I recall the bitter disappointment of realizing that the author didn't care as much as I did about the character as a reader. And this is a wonderful way for you to avoid that happening to Reacher. I mean, for me, he's a character that'll be living well beyond all of our lifetimes. And not only are the stories exciting, but they capture a period in a changing America, and you've got this distinctive style of storytelling, and a significant drop off would have been really disappointing. So, hooray for you, and hooray for Andrew. I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
thanks for that. And, it validates my decision. But the stumbling block, of course, was whether Andrew would say yes. And I was nervous about that. He is unbelievably stubborn and independent, and he was doing great stuff. The series he was writing at the time, I almost didn't ask him because I wanted to keep on reading that series that he was doing, and I knew that it would be an either or for him. So I was aware that by asking him to do Reacher, I would be denying myself the Janitor series that he was into at the time. And I thought he'll probably say no to this because, he wants to do his own stuff. But in a way, Reacher is his own stuff. It was almost not a family thing because our family is so disparate, but it was his and mine from the beginning. As he just said, his responsibility at the very beginning was to be honest with me, whether it was any good based on his own lifelong reading. And if he'd said, this is terrible, remember that job you were talking about last week in the warehouse? You should apply for that. He would have said that. And so it's partly his from the beginning. So I'm really happy that he said yes about it.
Andrew, when did Lee tell you that he would like for you to take over?
Well, this is I think it's a great story, and it was something that when you walk into a trap, and it's not until much later that you realized how carefully orchestrated something was. The second book in that Genesis series that he mentioned was coming out, and it was coming out in I guess January 19. It launched. And the nearest reporting store to where we live is down in Denver, Colorado. So, because we live in just at the southern edge of Wyoming. So I said to him, I've got this launch event coming up at the Tadcaster. Would you like to come? And he said, yeah, sure. And so, first of all, the first clue that I should have noticed was he said, let's go in my car. And he passed that off as simply a way in order to be able to smoke constantly on the way there and back, because he knows he's not allowed to smoke in my car. So we go down in his car. You go to the event, and you know what it's like when you're doing those events. You're thinking, am I going to trip over on the way to the stage? Am I going to forget my name? You just want to make sure that it goes well. And so all I was thinking about was the event. So we do the event, it goes fine. And then driving back, since he'd driven down, he said, well, why don't you drive back? So this is driving through northern Colorado in January, late at night, and the weather was appalling. We had one of these things they call a ground blizzard, where you get just an impenetrable sheet of snow and ice blowing horizontally in front of you from literally the ground up to about 20 feet, and you cannot see a thing. I remember saying to him, it's 50-50 whether we get home or whether we wind up in a ditch. Could go either way. And it turned out, of course, that he'd actually anticipated this and knew that I would be concentrating, basically 100% on not crashing the car. So we're driving up, keeping one eye on the GPS screen in the middle of the dashboard, because you can see more from that than through the windshield. And just suddenly out of nowhere, he says, "Yeah, so I'm thinking of retiring." And, I look back and I feel a bit guilty, because if I was a nice brother, I would have said to him, you know what? Yes, you should retire. You've worked hard for all of these years. You've brought pleasure to so many readers. You've helped so many writers and other people in the business. You should absolutely retire and, enjoy the fruits of your labor. But instead, as the very first Reacher fan in the world, I said, well, what do you mean retire? What's going to happen to Reacher? And he said, well, maybe you'd like to, to continue. And he knew that I wouldn't be able to just have a knee-jerk reaction because of the focus I had on driving through this awful weather. So, over the next day or so, I had time to think about it. And lots of different things went through my mind. But one of them was kind of what he was describing just then about the original way to end the series, this idea of Reacher bleeding out in a motel bathroom, because I think it was the third book in, you write one book and it could just be a standalone. You write two, it could be a sequel. By the time there's three, there's a chance that it is going to be a series. And I remember the launch event for the third book, I think it was the one that was in a place called Chesterfield in England. We were in this big old hotel, and in the question section at the end, somebody asked, how many books are you going to write in this series? And off the top, he said 21, which I think was really a nod to John D. MacDonald, who wrote 21. And so you could see people, doing the songs on their fingers. Okay, we've had 3, there's going to be 21. Okay, plenty to go, no problem. Everybody goes home happy. And every year at the launch event, somebody asked the same question, and he always gave the same answer. But then, as we got closer to 21, and in fact, even past 21, and they knew the numbers weren't there anymore, and they had this image that he spelled out of this, this brutal, brutal death on this motel bathroom floor, you could feel the temperature in the room fall. People were just so horrified and so upset about this possibility that there would be a world without Jack Reacher in it. And, they didn't want that. I didn't want that. And I most certainly didn't want that to be my fault, because I'd said no, because I was wanting to focus on something else. So ultimately, there were a few things that came into play, but that was the main one. I just thought, nah, this is a responsibility, but I don't want to be the one who causes Reacher to wind up on that motel bathroom floor.
Yeah. I noticed on the cover of In Too Deep that Andrew's name is a tad more prominent, maybe a half a pike larger than it was in the past. Does this mean that you're closer to a full handoff, or it means nothing?
Well, In Too Deep is entirely Andrew's book. That's 100% Andrew. And so we did a 4-book transition, and now he's setting off on what I hope is many, many years of doing it solo. So the jacket, yeah, it is. I mean, we haven't argued about it with the publishers, but you know what it's like. At that point, it becomes all kinds of a commercial decision on their part, and their own marketing and publicity and so on has a big influence on that. So it really should say something like Lee Child's Jack Reacher, then the title, then Andrew Child. That would be a more conventional way of doing it, I think. But the way they're doing it, that's up to them. I never interfere with publishing decisions because I always apply the shoe on the other foot test. For instance, they send me the mock-ups for jackets for upcoming books, and they say, "What do you think?" And my response is always, "No. What do you think? You're the experts. You're the graphic designers. You're the people that know roughly what other books are coming out next year when this one comes out. What do you think?" And I apply the shoe on the other foot test. How would I like it if the graphic designer emailed me and said, that bit in chapter 3, I think that's terrible. It's about horses for courses. It's about letting the experts do their work. And so I don't like to interfere with publishing decisions because it is a very abstruse and mysterious business that doesn't follow many rational rules, but some people are better at it than me.
Yeah. So we've spent our time talking about Reacher. Andrew, what's next for you beyond the Reacher series?
Well, we're already working on the Reacher for next year, which is going to be very exciting. It's going to be the 30th book in the series. So, I'm very excited about getting to be writing the 30th Reacher, and I'm very excited to see what happens when that comes out. So that's going to be fun. And as well as that, if at any point I manage to find a way of creating any extra hours in the day, I'll still like to come up with a couple more of the Janitor books, because I was having a lot of fun doing that. So mainly Reacher, but if there's time, then my effort would go into the Janitor, because I love that series.
Now, Lee, you've just released a new collection of short fiction. Does that mean you're going to keep writing?
In a way, I don't intend to, but that book was a collection of non-Reacher short stories. A few years ago, we did a volume of the Reacher short stories, and then somebody said, "What about the non-Reachers?" And over the years, you accumulate a big number of short stories because there's always somebody asking you to do one. So that's a collection of work, some of which is 20 years old. It's every year of my career, I've done many short stories for various reasons, and these are some of them. And I must say, it's fun to see them. It is fun to reread them. And to me, it's a completely different art form, short stories than novels. I think I'm a better novelist than a short story writer, but to see those little fragments, it's like a diary. This was what I was thinking that year. This is who I was. It is, really good looking back on it. And so hopefully I'll write this and that. I have a secret plan, actually, that if I find enough time, which is a stupid thing for a retired person to say, but it is still hard to find time to do anything. If I have time, I might secretly write a Reacher book and give it to Andrew and see if anybody notices. I think that would be a really fascinating experiment.
What do you think of that, Andrew?
Sounds good to me. Sounds like a year off, I'll tell you that.
Our guests today on Writers at Work have been Lee and Andrew Child. Men, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for your stories, and congratulations on continued success.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us on.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.